let's talk about the second book of Lankhmar by Fritz Leiber, books 5 to 7 in Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, rounding out the series. With this, if you have the 2 volumes that are in Fantasy Masterworks, or I don't know if they're now gone to Sci-Fi Masterworks, you have everything other than an early draft of what becomes the Sword of Lankhmar and a prequel story by Harry Otto Fisher, which apparently I think turns up, I only found this out recently, in Dragon magazine in the 70s. And he co-created the characters, and he wrote most of the Lords of Cornwall. So he is the other Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser author. He's not credited on the books, I think, because even Lords of Cornwall, Leiber kind of polished up and finished off, so he took the final credit. Whether that's fair or not, I don't know. Here we have the Swords of Lankhmar, often considered the best book in the series, and then Swords and Ice Magic and Knight and Knave of Swords, which are considered to be less good. This covers his work from the 60s to the 80s. He died in 1992 at the age of the ripe old age of 82, and the last novella was published 87 to 88. So he's probably writing at 86, 87. So he was 76, 77 when he finished writing the series. I think that will be significant in what I say. It is interesting seeing it, having read all these books, having read, 1,500 pages of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, one of my favourite series. It's worth kind of reflecting on the development where, Swords of Lankhmar is interesting. It's obviously a pinnacle or peak of the series in some ways, for a few reasons that continue through to the end in good ways, and some weaknesses too. But particularly, it's the nearest thing to an actual novel. This is basically Swords of Lankhmar is a novel. Swords in the Mist is a set of connected stories that mostly connect to the same thing, but are still in the same format, which are much more roughly linked. Whereas Swords of Lankhmar is very tightly linked together. With classically, because this is Leiber, some weird diversions, but it's much more tightly put together. And Swords of Lankhmar is about the fact that there's an issue with rats, potentially magical rats, destroying grain shipments maybe, or something else is destroying grain shipments. And that's very interesting and fun as a setup, because the setup is that Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser lead escort ships on the grain convoy to find out what's going on. And this causes really to get involved in one of the most dramatic and certainly long but dramatic and high stakes adventures yet. And then the second 2, books 6 and 7 overall, are to do with their travels in the north with an island called Rime Island, which are in various ways very different to the other books in the series, which is part of the reaction. The strengths for most of it are, I'll sum up, let's just say, strengths, and then we'll sum up weaknesses, because this is important to talk about what happens, particularly in the last book. But strengths are that it is very pacey, very witty, fun. The characters and their friendship is incredibly good and positive. There is, a great power of imagination, a lot of world building going on. It's an immensely enjoyable set of books. Just at a kind of very basic level, it goes beyond just the pulp enjoyment in the same way that Conan does. But you can start with just saying this is very fun, and it is very fun. I greatly enjoy reading it. It's, as I say, funny, clever, well put together, pacey, good, strong characters, good friendship, which is rare actually. Really strong friendships. Some people really like the Gentleman Bastards for that reason. I think there's also some interesting historical stuff where, when you realise how heavily influenced Terry Pratchett was by the Lankhmar books, a name for that city created by Harry Otto Fisher, in fact, rather than by Leiber. The fact that you see that style deepen, anthropomorphic death, who's somewhat humorous and odd, for instance, turns up here. The city itself, which is less important after Swords of Lankhmar, but is still nonetheless, reaches... Swords of Lankhmar heavily has the feel of Ankh-Morpork more than previous books. You read something like Swords Against Death, the second book in the Ordered collection, which is most of the early published stories, which I love. Swords Against Death, one of my favourites. And there you have which is much closer to a lot of the archetypal D&D inspiration fiction that I've talked about on this channel. You know, they're adventuring in dungeons, they're breaking into thieves' guilds, things like that. Swords of Lankhmar has some of that, but has a bigger story scope. But the point is that it's also something which spends a lot more time in the city. There are a few stories before that do, but this is a massive one to give you a real sense of the city they're in. There's some important stuff there that you see. Also a development, and this is important. I think is actually Mosia's strength, not a weakness. But there's Mosia's strength is that he decides to move the characters on in terms of saying, okay, they've done this stuff, now they're going to do this stuff. This is their Conan the King arc. The last two books end up with them ending up dealing mostly with a particular place, Rhymael, and the things that are to do with Rhymael, and the consequences of their actions over time, and how that affects Rhymael, etc., etc. That's very effective, and in and of itself, it's good. I think I appreciate the change. I think the last book, for instance, does try to deal with the issue of the romantic exploits over the years and try to just weigh the change in lifestyle from one stage to the other. It gives, and I'd say the Rhymael books have an enormously. I talk about Swords of Lankhmar being very well liked, but what you could definitely say about 6 and 7 is, I think the new cast in it, there's a big new cast in it who are recurring. Sif and Fritz and Groninger and Mother Grum and Shori and various other characters on the islands. That it's very successful and good, and it's I like them. I liked some very strong scenes involved them. I often in book 7 where serious problems begin to emerge. Often the stuff with the Rhine Islanders is the more pleasurable stuff. I thought that this movement was actually really positive, and in book 6 basically pulls this off very strongly. That they've gone on some adventures, and then they are. Eventually, after being chased, having to deal with Death's plots, they end up heading in for the second half of the novel. So, the first half is a variety of picaresque adventures, and then the second half, particularly, or just over half, is them heading north and finally dealing with a story in Rhymael, which I think is about 100 pages long, the final one. The penultimate story in the collection also has to do that journey. But 100 pages of introducing Rhymael, and a very interesting story, and a lot of fun stuff happening, and good, if you like Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse, you'll like it a lot, and establishing a new status quo. Swords and Ice Magic, though it is not the strongest novel, it has some very good stories. So Swords of Lankhmar, it's a triumph. It's really his biggest achievement. Not necessarily the best of the Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse books. I think Swords Against Death, Swords in the Mist are still as fun or more fun. But I think it does so many things, and here's stuff he's practiced before, ideas he's brought before. It heightens everything to a pitch. There are just kind of so many clever, funny moments. There are moments that are certainly historically, you can see influential on other authors. But yeah, Swords of Lankhmar is a triumph of a particular kind of Fafhrd the Grey Mouse, and then he moves back to something more similar to what he'd done before, in terms of more episodic in Swords and Ice Magic. And some of these stories are very, very good. And I think particularly Trapped in the Sea of Stars and The Frostmourne Stream are both good, shorter stories. And then Rhymael is, as a novelette, very strong. And then finally we get to Knight and Knave of Swords, which only has 4 parts, of which 3 are short, 2 are quite short, and one is kind of 50 pages, and then one is 180 pages. It is the second longest thing he writes overall. So, as in, he writes Swords of Lankhmar is the longest continual story. That is just one official story, and the second is The Mouse That Goes Below in Knight and Knave of Swords. And here's the thing. To sum up, because by this point you're getting into the development of all the stuff that's been going on over 7 books, and over 3 books, and over the 2 books that deal with Rhymael up in the far north. But the first 3 of these stories were mostly enjoyable. And The Curse of the Smalls and the Stars, the third one, is the most Pratchettian Fafhrd the Grey Mouse story, though it suffers from some of the problems I'll come into. And then the first 40 pages of The Mouse That Goes Below, it's 180 pages. The first 40 pages are kind of okay, you know, they're decent. You know, they have some niggles, but actually they're setting up some interesting stuff. And then it is one of the most bizarre, you know, 140 pages or whatever I've ever read of anything. Its biggest cardinal sin, as it were, is it's boring. It weirdly becomes very disjointed, confused structurally, and unable to keep pace, and dealing with and constantly going into digressions that are kind of partly about these themes of thinking about the Fafhrd the Grey Mouse and growing up. That is plainly, by the way, part of what's going on. I offer that as a defence to those a posteriori to those who have read it, rather than as a defence to you who may read it. But even with that very marginal defence that it is attempting to do with this theme, these digressions are lengthy, plot irrelevant on the whole, and bizarre. And the conclusion, there is actually the ghost of a good conclusion, but it's sort of patched together from, you know, the remaining oddments in the scrap bag, as it were. And so this is to bring us round, really, because I think about these digressions, which I think basically mean I'd recommend 2.5 of these books. Swords of Lankhmar, good. Swords of Ice Magic, pretty good. The first half of Knave of Swords, pretty good. Including Into the Mouse That Goes Below. And then 140 pages that basically are not worth reading, apart from the very end is kind of okay. And this is because, and I do think this has to be seen not necessarily just as a function of age, certainly some of the structural problems might be, but it's a problem that is always kind of on and off there. Basically, these are books which deal with heroes who have many romances. It is, you know, sexually suggestive throughout the books. But in the final couple of books, and particularly in the final book, this goes to bizarre lengths. It is there in Swords of Lankhmar too, which is exceptionally popular and people like. So some people may like this more than I do, so part of it might just be me, but I don't think so. I think with the final one, even if you quite like the saucy style, even if you could cope with some of the, and some things, I mean, basically to do with leering at girls, most of us would see as underage. You take that as you will. It's not absolutely horrendous, but it is pretty unpleasant at points, I found. But as I said, the issue of the cardinal sort of boredom comes in partly because in Knave of Swords, you get some of these bizarre digressions are essentially lengthy reminiscences about the romantic past of the characters. That is relevant. It's part of how they're dealing with integrating into their new lives. But you're getting basically just like not very good erotica out of it. And this becomes, as I say, particularly pointed here, even though I think it has begun to creep in. I thought this when I was reading it in Swords of Lankhmar, and it's always been there a little bit, but Swords of Lankhmar definitely has a bit of that. And by the point you're getting to The Mouse That Goes Below, particularly, it is essentially, for long stretches, bad erotica, in a way that, to be fair, isn't true before. This is where I do think age may provide an explanation, even if there is a trend from writing at his peak powers through to being a quite old man. But you're talking about something where he's in his mid to late 70s and his structural skill is gone, and his stylistic tics have also gotten more annoying. His vocabulary doesn't seem to have reduced, so we don't have the Agatha Christie explanation necessarily. But his structural tics have become worse, and then suddenly he's just writing stuff which is just completely bizarre. So, yeah, I think in terms, there is some of his best writing in these books. Some, you know, action stuff and some of the stuff on the seas in Swords of Lankhmar. Some of the action, the structural stuff there is really good. There's really beautiful stuff about Rime Isle actually as well. The descriptions, even into the last book, even to the back end of the last book, the descriptions of Rime Isle, this Iceland-like place, are beautiful and wonderful. The action is always good. The friendship's always good. So, but I think you kind of have to, if you want to get to where does the series leave off, you know, there's, you know, whatever scope there is for what could have happened afterwards in the sequels is one thing, but where the series leaves off when he dies, you have to kind of gird your loins, maybe steel your stomach a bit, and get through those last 140 pages. So yes, it's a tentative recommendation on the collection. Certainly read Swords of Lankhmar. I'd say certainly read Swords Nice Magic, with the caveat that you'll find a couple of weird bits probably. Knight and Over of Swords, you've heard what I have to say. If you've read these books, I'd love to hear what you think. So